Welcome to the Sustainable Development Movement, the concurrent session, Business Unusual, the new approach to resource mobilization in the face of declining development assistance in the region. But before we delve into things and introduce our speaker today, we're going to go over some housekeeping matters. As it relates to question and answers, questions will be taken in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. I'm going to ask you to utilize the question and answer bubble to pose your questions. If you post questions in the chat, they will not be addressed. The chat feature, you can use that as a meet and greet with each other. You can also use the chat to ask other non-content related questions. At the end of the session, we will also be launching a session evaluation poll, and you'll get an opportunity to give us your feedback in terms of how you feel the event went as it relates to this session. I'd also like to make special mention of the title and lead sponsor of the Sustainable Development Movement, the Republic Bank Limited, the most innovative bank in the world. And as we get down to business, we have a very special person, and I have the privilege of introducing His Excellency, Dr. Didacus Jules, the boss of the OECS Commission, and I report directly to Dr. Jules. I believe he needs no introduction. His topic is really pointed to what it is that the OECS Commission is trying to achieve in the business unusual era. He's a revolutionist. I remember describing Dr. Jules as a baby boomer who has millennial traits. He's highly innovative, cutting edge, visionary leader who is absolutely amazing. He understands business strategies, how to execute, and he's coming to share with us today some very important insights as it relates to innovation, process particular innovation, as it relates to how it is that you really engage partners and win together. And that is what his presentation is about. It is taking a very blue ocean type of look at how it is that you engage. We want to move away from the red ocean era where we compete. And in not competing, we create uncontested market space. And as a result of that, dominate the market and bring others with us. And with no further hesitation, I hand over to Dr. Jules. Dr. Jules, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and welcome to all participants online. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so our Haitian relatives have a term, Teta Sam, which we in St. Lucia and Dominica call Kudme, which denotes the communal assembly of heads, hearts, and hands to lift a heavy load. There is no better concept to embody the new approach to resource mobilization in the face of declining development assistance in the region than the Teta Sam. Heads, hearts, and hands in harmony to lift a heavy load denotes communal responsibility. It encompasses ideas and intellect, the mind shift, emotion and empathy, the heart shift, discipline and dexterity, the paradigm shift. Shared purpose creates mutual obligation, in which the obligation to give is no greater than the necessity to receive. Our Caribbean Nobel laureate Derek Walcott speaks of the evocative power of an image from his childhood. And he speaks of, and I quote, men running into town, changing shoulders as they carried a sick person in a hammock slung on a bamboo pole. And he asserts, and I quote again, this is charity. That is the real foundation, the unavoidable necessity, not of doing good or even seen to be doing good, but charity as work, as duty. It is not our duty to give any more than it is our duty to receive. But once we lose the tribal duty of help, the kudme, the Teta sound, we lose spirit and then a country. It has taken time, I have taken time to define the cultural antecedents from our own soil that should frame a discussion on development assistance. Because in the prevailing lexicon of Western political economy, aid is either a form of charity as a handout to the disadvantaged and or a tool of influence and dictation. Of course, this has not gone unchallenged. There is a wide body of erudite scholarship that has excavated the roots of underdevelopment and has exposed the link between the industrialization of the West and the long night of exploitation from slavery to colonialism to post-colonial hegemony. In the Caribbean intellectual tradition, this is represented by the works of C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right up to today's seminal work by economists like Dambisa Moyo, who wrote Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working, and How There is a Better Way for Africa. Whatever might be the ideological lens through which one chooses to view the aid issue, there's a broad consensus that while foreign aid has been helpful, particularly in disaster situations and humanitarian crises, the jury is still out on how effective it is in moving recipient countries from poverty to prosperity. What is clear is that aid is most effective when the receivers have a strategic vision of where they want to be and situate such assistance to be facilitative and consistent with the old adage of teaching a person to fish as opposed to giving him or her a fish. Aid as the perpetuation of mendicancy is clearly no panacea for development. In much the same way, aid is no fix for the injustice and the structural imbalances caused by exploitative and inequitable terms of trade. World Bank studies have shown that large-scale financial aid can promote growth and poverty reduction, but only in the context of sound economic policies. Evidence collected by the Commonwealth reveals that aid only has a large effect on growth in a good policy environment. Another rationale, a major rationale rather, for the provision of aid was predicated on the need to increase rates of growth of real GDP and to overcome two gaps that were seen as impediments to this growth. One was the savings gap, which impeded the local financing of investment, and the second was a foreign exchange gap that constrained the capacity to purchase technology needed to fuel modernization. In the 1990s, the emphasis on the growth postulation shifted from investment to incentives, from capital injection to institutional and policy interventions that promote growth, such as efficient investment, human capital development, and technological development. In June 2015, a UNDP report on financing for development challenges in Caribbean SIDS issued a strong call for the review of eligibility criteria from access to concessional financing, and noted that in spite of the fact that global flows of concessional development finance from bilateral and multilateral sources had increased since the 1990s, Caribbean SIDS were less successful in accessing these funds. In summary, it pointed to the following facts and contradictions of the Caribbean development spectrum. Caribbean SIDS have higher levels of per capita income and rank higher on the Human Development Index than many other SIDS. But this is counterbalanced by some endemic characteristics associated with their smallness, limited populations and in resources, diseconomies of scale, foreign trade dependence, and vulnerability to external shocks and climate change. Despite reasonable savings, domestic savings rate, a shortage of resources for investment occasioned by high ratio of government debt to GDP hampers the financing of long-term development and the delivery of social services. Foreign direct investment, which had been a source of development finance, has been decreasing in the region since 2009. A major factor impacting the access of the OECS to concessional financing has been the use of per capita national income as an indicator of eligibility. This has resulted in the exclusion of even middle-income countries with serious development challenges such as high levels of poverty, economic vulnerability, and climate susceptibility. In this current decade, climate change has emerged as the single greatest self-inflicted existentialist threat. As if this was not a sufficient wake-up call for humanity, the coronavirus pandemic brought human economic life to a screeching halt, and no one has been spared its ravages. Each of these catastrophic occurrences have had a knock-on effect on the other, which has further exhausted the availability of aid to small island developing states, as even their own countries have been affected. The international effect of the pandemic has been severe, as it has blanketed the globe with recession, depression, but certainly a very sudden standstill in a highly unpredictable context. Only time will tell how deep will be the impact of the global collapse on the capacity of traditional donors on their aid portfolios. Compounding this situation is the evolving political agenda in the West. In the United Kingdom, it is still unclear the extent to which Brexit has affected the aid agenda of the European Union, especially in relation to African, Caribbean, and Pacific states. Further complicating things is the decision to subsume DFID into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. A likely consequence of this may well be the subordination of British aid to trade priorities and political imperatives. What these trends signal to us is the need to radically debunk our assumptions on the availability of aid as an altruistic provision of the powerful designed to help us graduate to higher income status and eliminate the scourge of poverty. At yesterday's session on the blue economy, Minister Camilo Gonzalez of St. Vincent and the Grenadines poignantly reminded us of the structural and political impediments to our survival and our progress. Our scholars from Eric Williams to Walter Rodney provided the historical evidence that we are not poor because we are indolent. We are poor because we have been and continue to be impoverished by a global system that is structured to maintain dependence while extracting wealth through unequal terms of trade, unjust and unilateral impositions of rules, and standards designed to maintain inequity. As Camilo summarized it, we have been globalized, climatized, and stigmatized. As difficult and as life-threatening as the pandemic has been, it created the conditions that brought innovation, because the old solutions and approaches have been rendered no longer feasible or possible. For decades, we have been aware. We have analyzed many of the intractable problems of development, including resource mobilization. For decades, we've spoken about and argued about possible solutions, but we have lacked the zeal, the agility, and the courage to take that bull by the horns. COVID-19 forced us to do within 2 months some of the things that we have wavered about for 20 years. Remember that magical turn of the century, the year 2000, which was supposed to have been a turning of the page, a harbinger of a bright technology-powered future for the human race? Well, the reality is that we either shape the future or the future just happens. And to significantly shape the future, we need to refashion it, not just by identifying the problems that need to be fixed, but by imagining the possibilities that can be transformative. What is needed in this period, as Lisa mentioned, is blue ocean thinking, a process of visualization that sees the expansive new space outside of the cramped confines of the current and present location. An approach that challenges all prevailing assumptions and constructs new paradigms of perception. So let us think through what that blue ocean resource mobilization for a grouping of aspiring SIDS, such as the OECS, can be. We can start with a definition of the fundamental principles that would establish the architecture of the new resource mobilization approach. One, it's not just about money. In everyday discourse, whenever one speaks about resource mobilization, there's a natural tendency to equate this with financial mobilization. It's not just about mobilizing money. It's about creating an ecosystem that first encourages ideas and creativity. Secondly, incubates these ideas. Thirdly, provides a supportive architecture of policy, responsive institutional scaffolding, and blue ocean planning. Secondly, second principle, interrelated problems require integrated solutions. The difficulty in getting beyond many of our challenges is that we are constantly seeking a plaster for every sore, not diagnosing the essential underlying nature of the illness, and consequently only fixing part of the problem. Our challenges need to be seen in the ecological perspective, and the approach to them must be integrated, systemic, and sustainable. The third principle is to prioritize tangible, people-impacting solutions. Too often, too much energy and too large a proportion of available resources are expended on intangibles, such as consultancies, at the expense of the material and the substantial. The fourth principle is that process must be aligned to end goal and to strategic intent. The process of mobilizing resources can be as engaging, should be as engaging, inclusive, and participatory as our strategic intent requiring the availability of these resources. Put simply, it is not a give me this or that, but an invitation to make a substantial difference through participation in the initiative or the process. This is incidentally is one of the core principles of the SDM2020 movement, and our sponsors can attest to that. Having established these core principles, I wish to describe what we understand resource mobilization to be, and then I will move forward by speaking to the blue ocean possibilities that we are beginning to shape in each of these resource categories. We categorize resources into 5 categories: financial resources, human resources, technology, physical assets, and knowledge capital. Financial resources for our purposes comprise debt, equity, grant, or blended financial instruments. Human resources involves expertise at all levels, and importantly for us at the OECS, the network of human interaction that often makes the difference between success and failure. Cooperation is not to be underestimated. Technology, which is increasingly digital, but also encompasses, importantly, traditional expressions. Since the COVID pandemic, digital technologies have become indispensable to day-to-day operations, thus ensuring business resilience and continuity. But there is still something to be said about traditional technology, which has been a generational transmission of knowledge and wisdom that needs to be contextualized and situated in our contemporary environment. Physical assets involves the physical infrastructure required for operation, and knowledge capital generated by research and comprising both intellectual property and indigenous knowledge. It is important to note that conventional definitions of knowledge as capital do not always give adequate recognition to indigenous knowledge, an error which often leads to failure because context is everything in the application of knowledge. So from a blue economy perspective, for example, ignoring the generationally accumulated knowledge of coastal communities with respect to the climatic, the morphology and geography of a location has resulted in many touristic white elephants. We destroy the mangroves to clean up for the hotels to be built on the shoreline, and then the hurricane proves the error of our ways. And the fishermen who for generations have lived in that area could have told us that this would have been the outcome. Policy has been added to the typology, not because it is technically a resource in its own right, but because of its huge impact on the overall resource landscape. Now, while this typology represents a simple model, it has important conceptual value to us at the OECS because A, it defines our universe of resources, B, it recognizes that the various types of resources are not standalone elements, C, that they ought to be managed as an ecosystem, and D, that in the cross-pollination of these resources lie our best opportunities for blue ocean breakthroughs. As Matt Ridley put it in a 2010 TED Talk, through history, the engine of human progress and prosperity has been and is the mating of ideas, and that the sophistication of the modern world lies not in individual intelligence or imagination. It is a collective enterprise. Let us focus now on how we see the application of our typology in the face of our contemporary challenges and the opportunities for doing things differently, better, and more successfully. This reflection is a work in progress at the Commission, but it is being invigorated by SDM 2020, and it recognizes the inescapable need for us to do things in a more self-reliant manner. So we take finance. The mobilization of financial resources must be driven by financial innovation. And there are 4 dimensions described by IDB across which this must happen: financial depth, financial development, financial access, and financial inclusion. The IDB reported in its bulletin of March 2019, and I quote, that emerging research suggests positive linkages between financial depth, access to finance, and development outcomes, including economic growth and poverty reductions. For firms, particularly small and newly established enterprises, access to financial services is associated with stronger innovation, job creation, and growth performance. Other research also finds a strong positive relationship between financial inclusion and income equality. In this context, many countries around the world have begun to design financial development and inclusion strategies and policies with the aim of supporting faster and more inclusive economic growth. End of quote. A range of studies done by different agencies, ECLAC, IDB, Compete Caribbean, among others, interrogating the financial and entrepreneurial environment of the OECS, have essentially concluded the following: that banks in the Caribbean are highly uncompetitive and lack the incentive to innovate and attract clients. The system is essentially an oligopoly controlled by 4 or 5 banks, with one setting the rates and the others following. Availability, cost of financing, and bureaucratic processes are major obstacles for entrepreneurs, and for the average citizen, the cost of opening and maintaining accounts are too expensive. Credit markets in the OECS are relatively shallow, given our income levels and in comparison to other regional groups. Relatively high poverty and inequality levels are a challenge to financial inclusion. The Eastern Caribbean Central Bank is taking measures to address some of these challenges, one of the most significant of which is the establishment of the Eastern Caribbean Partial Credit Guarantee. And in fact, on that note, I would want to urge our listeners and viewers to tune in to the regular media discussions by the Governor of the Central Bank, Governor Timothy Antoine, which seeks to keep the Caribbean and the OECS public informed of those measures being taken by the bank that impact your pocket and your household. The Caribbean Association of Banks is playing an increasingly active role in strengthening the capacity, particularly of the indigenous banks. The major steps that we need to take going forward include the revitalization of the Eastern Caribbean Securities Exchange to provide equity capital, accelerate financial inclusion by facilitating, in collaboration, for example, with the credit unions, citizen shareholding. An encouraging note is that from the inception of the SDM, Republic Bank has been one of the institutions that immediately recognized the urgency of this pivot for financial services and are moving beyond the traditional boundaries. Our reflections on the opportunity and scope for financial innovation in the OECS and the Caribbean should also take account of the fact that creative actions on that front would also impact 8 of the 17 global sustainable goals. And these are ticked out here with the black circles. Nope. Reduction of poverty, reduction of hunger, good health, gender equality, good jobs and economic growth, reduce inequalities, and partnerships for those goals. Technology, our greatest opportunity to radically transform resource mobilization in the OECS comes from the utilization of fintech. Our central bank, again, is already engaged in the piloting of a digital EC dollar. And we anticipate that this will not only address existing barriers to inclusion, but will stimulate entrepreneurship, boost the vitality of the cash economy in a digital way, and considerably improve the ease of doing business. As in other regions of the world, the use of technology for crowdsourcing of ideas, resources, and funding is a major part of that paradigm shift. The application of technology in this domain opens wide the door of opportunity for us in the global digital economy. Let us touch on knowledge. In my secondary school days, I won't say how many years ago, but it's not so long ago, we were taught in economics that the 4 factors of production were land, labor, and capital. We even parroted that. The 3 factors of production, land, labor, and capital. In the past 20 years alone, we have seen the ascendancy of knowledge as a 4th factor. Arguably, knowledge as the product of research and the conduct of innovation is increasingly more important than the other factors of production today. Think about, for example, the rise of artificial intelligence, robotics, and machine learning, and their potential to significantly reduce labor, in some cases actually supplant labor as a factor of production. So I've just chosen to highlight these three components. But in conclusion, let me emphasize the importance of approaching resource mobilization as a process of ecosystemic engagement. In other words, ensuring that each element supports and complements the other. The provision of money must be reinforced by the application of technology, undergirded by knowledge, which is itself becoming increasingly transdisciplinary. So knowledge itself is in a process of rapid transformation. Even our physical assets and infrastructure themselves will need to be reassessed in the new normal mode of remote working and ubiquitous bandwidth. In fact, we are in the process of completing the designs for our new OECS headquarters. And this is supposed to be one of the most, we hope it to be the best example of completely green, LEED certified, the greenest headquarters building in the Caribbean. And in fact, one of the challenges that we face now with the advent of COVID is to go back to the drawing board to look at all of the protocols that have now emerged in the living with COVID phase to determine what is the implication of that for the design of the building. Thankfully, our architects have been visionary enough that it just requires minor adjustments. So human expertise itself is also being redefined in perplexing directions from the previous norm. Let me give you a simple example. Just consider how COVID reversed the hierarchy of occupations to give indispensable prominence to sanitation workers and cleaners. The workers who are at the bottom of the totem pole have now been elevated to center stage in our quest for survival under COVID. In reinventing our approach to resource mobilization, we would be wise to be guided by the admonition of the esteemed Caribbean man of letters, George Lamin, who advises that the architecture of our future is not only unfinished, the scaffolding has hardly gone up. We hope that this SDM 2020 will accelerate the construction of that scaffolding, and that this construction of a new reality will be grounded by our ancestral tradition of the Tetasam Kudme, the communal assembly of heads, hearts, and hands to lift this heavy load. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jules, for that very strategic and knowledge-focused, highly practical orgasm of strategies surrounding innovation. Now, just to recap before we open the floor for a question and answer, we still have about 10 minutes that has left over from the speaker's presentation. So we heard about the mind shift, the heart shift, and the paradigm shift. And we also understood a very important principle that came from the Bible about teaching man how to fish and the importance of doing that rather than giving man a fish. And that is directly linked to the fact that we are impoverished because of the activities of countries or global powers then that want to push and force their own agenda. And it's important that we decrease the aid, decrease dependence on foreign direct investments. However, it is important to have sound economic policies. Those are some of the points that came out of Dr. Jules' presentation. He also spoke about the importance of taking a blue ocean approach to resource mobilization that looks at redefining what resource mobilization really is. And the first strategy on that looks at creating an ecosystem that facilitates ideas and creativity. That's very important. And also getting integrated solutions, which speaks to co-creation. And the last thing he spoke about was prioritize people impacting solutions and aligning the process with the end goal. Now, there are some questions that are online that I'm going to go to Dr. Jules. This first comment: what should the intellectual property regimes at the national levels consider to create an innovative environment and spill off benefits? Given the international divide on how to approach intellectual property for traditional knowledge and practices, what position should the OECS adopt on its management for development opportunities? Dr. Jules?
Okay, I have to take this piece by piece. The first one has to do with the, repeat for me, please, the first question.
What should the intellectual property regimes at the national level consider to create an innovative environment and spill off benefits?
Well, again, to quote where I ended up on the quote from George Lamin, we have not even started to erect the scaffolding, far less the building, especially when it comes to intellectual property. It's only in the last, 5-10 years, we've seen the emergence of organizations like ECO, which is the Eastern Caribbean Copyright Organization, that is seeking to preserve copyright for our artists. That point about starting to finishing the scaffolding is critical, because we speak glibly about participation in the orange economy, for example, and we have not done anything with anything substantial with putting in place the architecture of laws, regulations that will manage intellectual property. Even when this is done, again, to speak to the point I made earlier about things not being in silos, there are other supporting elements that need to be built into that. So intellectual property doesn't stand on a leg by itself. I used to be the registrar of the Caribbean Examinations Council. One of the things we lamented is that there's this whole suite of subjects that relate directly to the orange economy. So you have drama, you have music, well, creative arts, and the registration, you have art and design. The registration for these three subjects at CSEC level is less than 1%. In the case of music, it's 0.01% of the registrants every year, which makes that subject almost, from a business perspective, uncompetitive and not really worth offering an exam, because too few candidates participate in that exam. But how can we be talking about Caribbean music as a genre genres with global possibilities and potential, and yet only 0.1% or 0.01% of our candidates are doing this subject? Where are our musicians going to come from? What is the training that our musicians are getting? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the national level in terms of starting from the education system, also in terms of those institutions responsible for promoting services, especially in the creative sector, to educate, and we need to work collaboratively on this. So institutions like ECO working alongside the small business promotion enterprises or organizations, the BSOs, in order to help our artists, our writers, everyone who needs to make use of intellectual property patents and rights to understand what this is all about. And even in terms of directing careers, there are very few intellectual property lawyers in the OECS. I'm sure Genevieve Remy, who is, a well-recognized expert in trade law and intellectual property, wouldn't mind if I said this, but as an island scholar in St. Lucia, her ambition was to have been a lawyer. And when I, as PS education, discussed with her what are you going to do with the law? She said, well, she'll probably do criminal law or something. I said, you're an island scholar and you're going to waste your mind doing criminal law to come back to do what? Defend people who are engaged in fights. There are so many areas where we have no expertise in the Caribbean. Law of the sea, intellectual property, entertainment law, trade law. And she was an exceptional student. She got scholarships to go further to do master's programs and ultimately a PhD in those areas, and has just flown to the greatest heights possible in that arena. So the guidance is necessary in all areas. We need to put those structures in place, in the law, in the regulations, in the education system, and in the training of the users of or the holders of intellectual property rights. We do have an alliance at the OECS with a Trinidadian lawyer who has done the business of carnival. She started it off as the business of carnival, but it's become much broader than the business of carnival. It's full-fledged in intellectual property rights.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jones. I love this other question, and it speaks to the whole existence of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy being positioned as a stumbling block for progress. And this is how the participant puts the question: how do the youth get their leaders and officials to adopt these innovative suggestions and implement policies that facilitate them?
Well, I think the youth have to become more vocal in their own right. At the OECS, we have a youth strategy called YES, which stands for Youth Empowered Society. And there are 7 pillars to that strategy. One is, in fact, how I remember them is how the young people themselves in shaping this policy categorize it. Yes, for Youth Empowered Society, yes, I learn. Yes, I earn. Yes, I learn for education and training. Yes, I earn for employment and entrepreneurship. Yes, I belong for citizenship. Yes, I matter for child rights and protection. Yes, I move for sport and well-being, sports and well-being. Yes, I inherit for environment and so on. And I'm saying this because I think the young people have to be empowered. Unfortunately, our structures, historical structures in Caribbean society, do not foster empowerment. And as the old adage goes, power is something that is not usually given, it is taken. And young people have to stand up and be counted and have the courage of their conviction. You will make mistakes as a young person, but at the same time, it is the courage of your conviction and the sincerity of your aspirations that will see you through. So, so that's one part of the answer. The second thing is that I think if young people become more vocal and assertive about their perceptions, their requirements, their aspirations, then the leaders will begin to listen. I think it is very easy for people to say, well, politicians don't listen, but they do listen at election time. And the question then is to make sure that they keep listening after elections. So it is how the autonomous organization of young people is important. They have to, become more active in society. And certainly, I would encourage the person who has that question to go on our website and look at what we're doing with the youth empowerment strategy, because it is all about crowdsourcing ideas from young people, right? It is the saddest thing, I think, in the Caribbean today on the youth front is the fact that all the youth strategies and the youth policies that exist in ministries of youth have been written by older people like myself. I used to be a consultant with the ComSec, written by older people for young people. That is definitely not the way to go. Young people need to be consulted. We need to facilitate them writing the policies that they aspire to. And that is what we've been doing with the YES strategy. With the pillars I mentioned, we have piloted this in St. Lucia. And we've gone to communities far and wide. We met with all organized youth and met with unorganized youth. I remember going in a community called Debara, and people meeting a group of Rastas. And the guys were discussing, and it's not a complex thing. Regardless of your level of education, everybody can define their own aspirations. So we asked them, guys, what are your aspirations? What are the things that you would like to see government put in place, not for you, but to enable you to do the things that you aspire to do? And the conversations have been absolutely amazing. And it is from that crowdsourcing of ideas that I think youth policies should be shaped.
Thanks, Dr. Jones. Now, this one is pushing the needle a bit, and it speaks to, you've presented some very dynamic strategies that are innovative, and as the topic suggests, it's business unusual strategy, yeah? And this person is asking, how do you pretty much get the OECS member states to become conducive to such drastic changes in how resources are mobilized? Because it's not the norm.
Well, the first thing starts with having a good relationship with your heads of government, so that there's that honest dialogue. I think one of the sad things about our public services sometimes is that public servants, especially those in high places, have a reluctance to speak truth to power. And it is very important that we be honest and respectful in our conversations with our heads. Contrary to a lot of prevailing stereotypes about politicians, they're not immune to logic and to reason argument, especially if it can be a pathway to progress. Because at the end of the day, if I am in a government that is making progress, it is only to my benefit. So there are these opportunities that we can make use of. But can you repeat the question? Because there was another dimension to it that I wanted to pick up on. I'm not hearing you, Lisa.
Do you think the current policy space in OECS member states is conducive to the drastic changes in how resources are mobilized?
Yeah, well, let me finally complete the answer to that question by making a distinction between the current policy space, as in this period we are in now with living with COVID, and the pre-COVID space. If you had asked me that question pre-COVID, I would say definitely not, because we are just hamstrung by bureaucracy, stymied by apathy. There is a great deal of indifference to the execution of public policy in many spaces in the public sphere. But post-COVID, because of the shock that this thing has given to our system, and the implications have been so wide and deep across our societies, I think everyone recognizes, including our heads of, perhaps more so our heads of government and even perhaps the person in the street, the deep implications of this COVID pandemic. Because it's not just a pandemic by itself. Remember, I showed an early slide that showed tidal waves. There was COVID, then there's the economic recession, and then there's climate change. Now, these three things, the convergence of these three catastrophes has been such a great threat to our very existence that we now have to completely rethink the way we do things. And I can certainly say that our heads of government are very conscious of that reality. And we've been meeting, the heads of government of the OECS agreed to meet every fortnight, just 2-3 item agendas so that we can focus on what we're doing, make decisions, move forward. That in itself is a very different approach to doing things. We have had for the last 3 years a WhatsApp groups of all the main decision makers. Every PS education, chief education officer is in a WhatsApp group with the OECS, with the relevant persons at the OECS. Heads of government are in a WhatsApp group with myself. And We even change our rules of procedure to allow for decisions to be made using WhatsApp. So I put up a document, a short document on WhatsApp, outlining the challenges and the decisions and seeking approval of the heads. And within a short period of time, usually within the space of 12 hours, if it is really urgent, we follow it up with a phone call to draw their attention. We are able to have decisions made. So, you know, it's a very different period and we have to adjust to it and come with new ways. And that will require a shake-up of some of the old patterns of behavior in the public services.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Joes. I believe we have time for about 2 more questions. Now, this one is long, but I'm going to read it because some important truths are in there. It says, the opportunity that COVID-19 presents is the platform or reason to transition to a sophisticated technological environment. Both national and international agencies are looked upon to lead the general populace to a better position, and this summit is an attempt to achieve such. How or where do you think the general population could assist the OECS, CARICOM, and national boards in reaching this new paradigm?
Well, to start with, you cannot have a conversation with one voice alone. You can have a monologue. And the worst part of a monologue is if you realize you're only speaking to yourself. We have made a concerted effort at the OECS to reach out to the public, and you will see, well, not only is this an expression of that, but then our communications mechanisms are being improved. You're going to see a much stronger outreach to the public in many ways to share information. So one of the things I would urge people to do is to log in to the OECS website to sign up to receive our fortnightly bulletins so you can know what is happening there. You will also increasingly see that it's not about bragging rights about what we do at the OECS. It is also becoming a platform for sharing information and opening people's eyes to our immense possibilities. You go on the OECS website right now, you will find, for example, there's I can't recall the immediate name, perhaps you could help me, Lisa, but we have a series where we showcase outstanding young persons from the OECS and the diaspora. One of them is a young Grenadian, for example. He's a scientist, he's under 35 years of age, Dr. Wayne Carter. He has developed a technique for printing, 3D printing of human organs. So they will take, if you have a bad kidney, some good cells from your kidney, grow them and print a new kidney for you. Now, you can imagine how revolutionary and cutting edge that is. Somebody like Wayne could never have made it remaining in the OECS because we just don't have that technology. But it is important for us to highlight young people with that capability so that other young persons can see and be inspired. And more importantly, from the OECS end, that's where the conversation begins to connect with our leaders and our governments and the public service apparatus, and even the point raised earlier about intellectual property rights. If we had a good regime, just as we have in the BVI, a regime for financial services, where you have trillions of dollars coming through the BVI in the financial services industry, can't we have an equivalent of that with intellectual property and patents? So imagine if Dr. Carter is able to patent his invention, his developments here in the OECS. All of the patent profits will be flowing through the OECS economy, aside from the inspirational value of his work being brought to the attention of young people. So that's one thing. Being in touch is important, and sharing information. And also talking back to us. It's not about just receiving our emails and our blasts going out. It's also communicating with us, telling us, providing ideas, giving us ideas. I think it's very important for institutions to listen to what people are saying and to be responsive. I remember when I was at CXC, I got out of the blue a letter, a very condemnatory letter from a Bajan gentleman saying that, you know, CXC is promoting elitism because we only recognize the top student in every subject. And, you know, this is really promoting elitism. Of course, it's very important to recognize the top student. What came out of his criticism was that we then started publishing the top 50 students in every subject area. And all of a sudden, you saw names appearing of schools that nobody even in the public knew existed because they were not seen as the elite schools. So rather than just a Queen's College in Guyana or a Combamere in Barbados appearing on the top list, suddenly you had like, and St. Mary's College in St. Lucia, you would have Choiseul Secondary having students among the top 5. You would have St. Rose Secondary in Grenada. We need to listen.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jules. And just before we launch the poll, there is this one last question I want to pose because I have a personal interest in this question. All right, it says, after SDM, then what?
I'm worried, I hope it's not a period.
After SDM, then what? What next? They want to know what next, what will happen next?
That's an unfair question, you know, Lisa. You should be helping to answer that question. SDM is unprecedented and it's the first time we've done it. It took a lot out of the commission. Right now we have about 50 members of staff doing nothing but SDM. This appears, what you've seen on your screen appears simple, but maybe we'll do an article in our news media and show behind the scenes what has happened with SDM, because we've had the sets that you saw in the opening have been designed by our internal graphic artist who was formerly the receptionist at OECS, and her imagination is unbounded. And it was one thing to see the design that she did, it was something else to see it actually built and created under her direction. So all hands have been on deck. There's been a tremendous amount of work. When we end this SDM 2020, there are a number of things that will happen. We are going to go through all of the comments, the recordings, and so on to see the criticisms, the suggestions, the ideas that have been put on the table, and begin to categorize and shift through that. So that crowdsourcing of ideas is going to be mined from the process. Secondly, we're going to have to look at how do we do this in the future? Do we do it every year? Or do we do it every other year because of the energy and the commitment that it requires, the time? Or do we look at a different model of alternating models of engagement with the public? So this year we do SDM 2020, next year we come with something that would blow you all out of the water, but different from this format. One of the things I'd certainly like to do is to purchase the platform that you're viewing this on, the VFES platform, have something like that for the OECS, belonging to the OECS. Now that is going to take our public engagement to a completely different level. So stay tuned. We look, you know, keep sharing your ideas with us as well as your criticisms. They are important because it is only through criticism we can grow. And we certainly look forward to maintaining that connection to everyone who has logged in.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. And Dr. Jules has really taken us through a very riveting 1 hour. And just to add as well in terms of what will happen next, SDM is not just an event, it's a movement, and there are several partnerships that have been birthed out of the SDM, and I can't emphasize the tremendous support that we've gotten from the Republic Bank Limited that is led by Derwin Howell. They are the most innovative bank in the region, and I keep saying that as if it was their tagline, but that's how they operate. That's the culture of the organization. They embody and epitomize the full execution of SDG 17 that looks at partnership for the goals. So I'm going to encourage you to continue completing the poll. Fill out the poll. The engagement has been amazing. Continue to enjoy SDM 2020. We end today with the world-renowned motivational speaker, Les Brown. Les is going to take you from the realm of limitation to the realm of possibility, and we're going to grow wings and fly this afternoon. It has been an absolute pleasure serving you. Continue to win. We're zooming out from the OECS Commission.
Thank you, everyone.